I've encountered this particular situation so many times that the various episodes of it tend to blend and mesh together in my mind. But it always starts the same. I would walk up to a student, noting their frustration, and as we talked, the reason would quickly come out. Some aspect of their piece was disappointing them. Inevitably, this comes down to expectations. But whether it was horse or robot, landscape or moon base, my question would often be the same. Where are your references and your sketches? Oddly, especially considering the classes that I ran, I would frequently get some manner of the same response. I don't like using references because it feels like I'm cheating. What does it mean to cheat at art? If copying is cheating, if working from reference is cheating, what does that mean? And is there any truth in it? To some of you, this might seem like a very silly notion, and yet, over 11 years of teaching in the public schools here in the US, I could not even begin to list out how many times I ran into this exact situation. I ran into it in a different way when I was in art school as well, but it's a pretty common thing. People seem to have some aversion to what they see as copying. And sometimes it's the idea of cheating, sometimes it feels like it's illegitimate, or just like they're not using the full extent of their powers to do it. Whatever the reason, it's something worth talking about. Well, my name is Zach, and welcome to podcast episode 86. Today we are discussing copying art, and more specifically, I'm going to be defending both the act of copying and trying to dismantle some of the stigma that comes with it. As usual, I'm going to explore what I mean by the topic, and then go over how this might actually affect you as an artist. Though I'm going to start adding some of my own closing thoughts at the end, so stay tuned for that. Feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon link below as we get started. And actually, before we get started, let me know in the comments below. Do you ever copy? Is your copying limited to references to real life, or do you work from the work of other artists? Let us know. Well, first off, what do I mean by copying? Copying in art generally refers to looking at a visual resource and translating that from photograph or screen or reality into a new medium. This might be a drawing or painting or sculpture, but the copying by its nature translates the topic from one medium to another. In general, this is broken into three basic categories, and I'll take a minute or two and kind of explain each one after I just list them here. Copying from the world around you, copying from references, copying from other artists' work. So obviously working from the world around you might be the oldest version of this. This is simply walking outside when you want to know how to draw a tree and sitting there and actually drawing a tree. This, of the three categories, has the fewest people who oppose it. Though in my time teaching and in school, I still ran into people that felt like there was something less artistic, less creative about this venture. The next version of that is copying from references. Sometimes this is from a photograph, and sometimes this is from a screen, as everyone seems to have access to a phone or a computer or tablet of some kind nowadays. When I was growing up, we would honestly print things out, or we would just have to find books that had this information in them. This one tends to get a little bit more flack, and one of the primary concerns that comes up is the fact that we see as humans with two eyes at the same time, so there's depth perception. And when you reduce things down to an image, you are eliminating that depth perception. It is now an actual flat image, whether it's on a screen or exists in reality. The counter to this is the fact that your drawing is also going to be of the same manner, so sometimes it's actually easier to translate that well. But this is the second category. The third, and the one that is the most tempestuous in the artistic community, is copying from another artist's work. Now, as we're going to talk about in a moment, this is different from copying another artist's work and claiming it as your own. What I'm talking about here is just going, I really like the Disney style. I'm going to copy some of their characters and learn how they're put together. I really like how Arcane is animated. I'm going to copy some of their painterly techniques, and I'm going to explore those. That's what I'm talking about here, not pawning it off as being your own, but really exploring the artistic stylings of another artist. The caveat that I have to talk about here before we go into the breakdown is plagiarism and copyright issues. These are complicated issues. By and large, you avoid almost all of these if you refrain from selling something that is copied. In general, if you are copying another artist's work or a piece of reference material that is another artist's work, you are in the clear as long as you're not claiming it's your own, or as long as you're not trying to sell it. Most of the issues come up in those realms, either claiming something's your own when it's not, or selling something. But, in the nature of a caveat, I am not a lawyer, I am not a law professional. If you are trying to pursue something in a particular avenue, I would recommend that you look into these more adequately. But in general, that's my understanding as a professional artist, as an art teacher, as a strange internet man, is that if you don't claim it as your own, and if you don't try to sell it, generally, you're in the clear. The law is based around being transformative, and in general, the law is built to try to help and aid the artist, though that's not always how it works out. Alright, I'm going to start by talking about and trying to dispel some notions associated with copying and working from reference, and then after that, I'm going to just literally try to defend it. I think these are two distinct areas, trying to dismantle some of the issues that you might have had yourself or might have heard from some people in your life, and then also just push the idea of copying as not just being okay, but actually a really good choice to make as an artist. So the first notion I want to take a look at is that real artists work from their imagination rather than copying. This argument at its very base level is fundamentally flawed because when you pull things from your imagination, when you're working from imagination, you're working from a visual library. That visual library is built and sustained based on reality. It's not like you can conjure an image of a tree in your mind if you've never seen a tree before. We are visual creatures as humans, and we have to see things in order to be able to replicate them in some manner. In fact, even when you try to work from your imagination, and the artists who are really good at it do the same things, they're pulling a lot of references that they have from the world around them. Now, this doesn't mean that the best artists will work from reference all the time. In fact, I'm reminded of a conversation that Steven Zapata had talking about reference material a while back. He is a pretty well-known defender of art from AI art, and then he's a really astoundingly gifted pencil artist. And you can find his work on here. I'll link him below. But he talked about how nowadays he doesn't usually work from reference in the middle of a piece. What he will actually do is he will pull up a whole bunch of reference material and take a portion of time and study things, really analyzing them and understanding and sometimes even taking notes. But when he's actually working on the piece, he said he doesn't distract himself with the references. This I add because it's a fairly unique perspective and not something I've seen a lot. But also in his conversations, he talks about how he is really far along on his artistic journey. And when he was younger, when he was in his youth and still learning, he worked from references religiously all the time. And this is something that we see from a lot of artists who really continue to push themselves and progress. Loish is another really well-known artist that comes to mind when I think about this topic. If you follow her on Instagram or if you look through any of her books or anything, she does a lot of work for big studios, but a lot of her work is actually practice. She does a lot of drawing animals and figures at the airport and out in public. She does a lot of drawings of trees. These are just simple explorations of the reality that she's seeing. And of course, once you've done that enough, you do have the ability to create more efficiently from your imagination. The world is immensely complicated, and looking at individual things and copying them down not only actively records that information and reference material in your mind, but it also unconsciously records the relationships between those objects and their physical appearances. There's a lot of ineffable, ethereal qualities to the things that we want to draw. And when we copy from reality, we are often encompassing and including things that we wouldn't have if we hadn't been copying. When I try to draw a tree from my mind, I am pulling from essentially a dumbed down zipped file of what a tree looks like. I can still get relatively close. I can get close enough for myself and for other people to recognize what it is that I put down. But if I were to go work from an actual tree or even a photograph of a tree, the drawing is going to be better. There's just no way around it. I run into this all the time, even with drawings like you're seeing in the background here. I know that if I look up reference material for my drawings, they turn out better. I still do have some natural push against that. I don't know if it's a little bit of laziness or if it's just I don't want to put in the extra work. In fact, if I really had to guess, it's the fact that when I'm in the mindset of wanting to draw, for me, that's a different mindset than working from reference materials or looking up reference materials. That's a different piece of me, and it's difficult for me to shift between those stances. Maybe you're similar, and the strategy that I've employed there is when I plan big pieces, I will actually plan the piece via sketches, go look up things that I need to practice some of those strategies, especially if I'm inking things that I'm not familiar with. And then I have that as a resource page off the side when I'm working, and it's really, really helpful. I've done that on most of my larger pieces. In fact, a lot of the pieces that I do here for the podcast come out that way. But that's kind of the first notion that I want to work against. Real artists work from their imagination rather than copying. Historically, most artists have accumulated their skills by copying. And in fact, most of that copying back in the day was done from master's studies, which is, like I mentioned earlier, actually the category that nowadays is fraught with the most tempestuous responses from the artistic community. And yet, that's how most of the famous artists in history learned. They copied their master or other masters. Copying is just a part of what it is to be an artist. And while working from your imagination is really cool, that does not qualify you as being an artist. The second notion that I want to work on dispelling is that reference photos are cheating. Building references is super important, like I just mentioned before. And this is kind of a strange thing. I don't know if this is because photography and its use as reference material is kind of new to the artistic world. Art as we interpret it now is at least 1,000 years old. It's something we've been working on for a long time. And photography is about 100 years old. But despite that, we've only really used photography for reference material in the way we do now for about 10 to 20 years. And I mean this specifically in how it's referenced on the internet. Because again, when I was growing up 30 years ago, we didn't have access to the internet. Even in its first couple years, it was pretty devoid of anything. Nowadays, you can find an image that you want at the drop of a hat. It is so easy. It's really remarkable. This is something I ran into when I was teaching because it was just such a different world that I grew up in versus what my students were growing up in. And I think a big change is happening now as well. When I'm talking to my friends that are still teaching, the inclusion of AI, the availability of it is such a different thing. Every paper now has to be run through things to see if a student used AI on the paper. And then you have to try to sift through the pieces and realize that this is going to be a technology that's going to exist. What are the ethical and moral ramifications of it? The students are going to use it. They're going to use it for college. They're probably going to use it to write resumes and cover letters and reference letters and all these things. How can we instruct them in a way that is productive and is good and utilize the new tools? You know, we as artists are aware of this drama. This has come up with the advent of photography in general and digital art and all these other things. But it's just interesting to see how different things were a while back compared to today, even when not that many years have transpired. And this, I think, is part of the reason that reference photos can sometimes be considered cheating, because we just haven't had access to them in that way for that long. But they're not. They're not cheating. Even if we were to sit here for 20 or 30 minutes and try to define what cheating means in art, references are certainly not that. And what is the alternative, right? Staring at things and then copying them from your memory? I could argue that you're still doing the exact same thing there. Again, if you want to draw a tree, but you feel like using a reference photo is cheating, then you're going outside and staring at that tree. That's totally fine. But you're going to take a photo of that exact same tree and now that's not fine? Is it fine as long as you took the photo? This snowballs pretty quickly and becomes something that is no longer a logical argument, but it's got all these emotional tendrils attached to it. Using reference photos for most people is the most effective way to learn and imbibe of new information. Not only is it not cheating, but it's actually a tremendously advantageous manner of study, because I can't go and see what a whale looks like. I can't go find a polar bear somewhere locally, but in 10 seconds, I can find a slew of photographs of those things and I can work from them. I can't necessarily go into my little teeny mountain town here and find another pen and ink artist who can show me a technique. And yet I can look up a reference for different hatching techniques and different stippling techniques online in just a few moments. It is not only not cheating, it's a tremendously advantageous strategy. In class, I showed and recommended references for some projects, and often I required them for final projects. This is because I wanted to push against this notion that using references makes you less of an artist or it's cheating or anything like that. The reality is that my students, even the ones who were very opposed to it, when I was able to walk them through a lesson and show them what happens, let them see how much better their art gets, how quickly it improves when they look at references, in that case, most of them were willing to go with me. Often this would be a project where I would have them draw a giraffe, and then you would watch all of their drawings and they'd be goofy and we'd have some laughs about it. Maybe I would try to do the same thing. And then I would put a picture of a giraffe up on the screen at the front of the classroom and then give them a couple minutes. And then I could even take the image away and let them draw it again. And pretty much every student in that class would be astounded with how much they had improved. And if I leave the image up where they can actually work from it as a reference image in that moment, there is tremendous growth. References are a wonderful and really easily applicable way to grow and to expand your visual library, but also in the moment to just give you that little bit of a push to make that piece individually better. I rarely work on a painting where I don't use a reference. In fact, I have a gigantic file on my cloud storage. I still feel weird about all that jazz, but I've got a cloud storage folder that has tons and tons of images, maybe 200 to 300 that I've handpicked. They're all copyright-free images. They're Creative Commons, so you're allowed to use them for commercial uses. And I keep them, and they are, references of birds and references of bugs and portraits and all these things that I can use for professional paintings. That's part of how I use my strategy to do it. And I do make sure that the images are copyright-free, that the people who have taken them have donated them, essentially. And if I was working on a much larger scale, there's a good chance that I would either take the photos myself or I would purchase them. It's not something you necessarily need to worry about if you're just working on improving and getting better. Reference photos are not cheating. They're not even bad or something you should lie about and, hold back from talking about with other people. It's just a part of the game. Following this up, rather logically, is the notion that copying is cheating. I mentioned this in the intro, but the first and perhaps most important thing to talk about here is, what is cheating when it comes to art? Obviously, lying and claiming ideas are yours when they are not is a bad thing. But is it wrong to copy from someone else's work because it is helping you grow more quickly? Is it wrong to practice someone else's song to learn how to sing or play guitar better? When I put it in those terms, it seems funny almost. I've run into countless people over the years who feel like copying from references is wrong. But by far the most people I've run into that have an issue here are the people that have an issue with copying from another artist's work. Many students that I taught over the years thought this was an immoral, despicable act. And yet those same students were likely downstairs right beneath my classroom working on their violin or viola parts, playing someone else's music. When you start to think about it in those terms, it does seem a little silly. If you're trying to practice becoming a better vocalist, you're not confined to only writing and performing your own songs. You are likely finding a repertoire of songs that have been compiled by someone else that will allow you to expand your range and practice the things that you need to practice. When you start playing an instrument, especially if you're just playing something like guitar or piano, you are almost entirely playing other people's songs. It takes a lot of proficiency with an instrument before you can start writing your own music. And yet I don't even think from the public eye it's necessarily seen as better. In fact, I've run into a lot of people over the years who find it funny that most of the music that I play is my own music that I write. I don't do this because I feel like it's the moral high ground. I do it because I'm an artist and I like writing and exploring things. But if you think about that, we're totally fine with that culturally. We're fine with the random guitarist sitting in the corner of their room playing a whole bunch of emo and punk songs. And yet, when we see an artist who's copying stuff from anime or from manga or from professional artists, we've got this cultural idea that that's somehow lesser, when in reality, I think they're exactly the same. Now, obviously, if you are claiming someone else's work is your own, that is wrong. That is illegal in some manner, depending on if you're making any money or if you're taking any reputation away from that person. Those things are wrong, but that's not what we're talking about here. In general, I'm talking about I want to get better at drawing robots. I'm going to go find an artist who draws robots, and I'm going to copy specific mechanisms of how they do that. If you want to get into an art studio, if you want to get your work into an art gallery, it not only makes sense to copy art that is similar to what you want to produce, it is probably the most efficient way to get there. If you are trying to get your art to take on an impressionistic style, but you're prohibiting yourself from looking at any impressionistic work while you're working, that journey is going to take a tremendous amount of time. And I would argue that it's a tremendous waste of time, because there's nothing wrong with just sitting there and copying from that artist's work. Trent Kanuiga has talked about this before on this platform. I'll link him below as well. He's worked in the games industry. He actually just dropped a game on the Nintendo Switch called Twilight Monk, which, if you have any interest in any of those kind of Metroidvania games, I would encourage you to check it out. I have purchased it. I haven't played it yet. I'm just a big fan of his work and happy to give him the $20 it was for that game. Shout out to Trent. But he has talked a lot about, if you want to work as a game artist or concept artist or comic artist, you are going to have to go work from and try to make your art similar to the areas that you want to get into. If you want to work for a company like Blizzard or Bethesda, you should go look at their work. You should copy from it, understand what all of the constituent parts are, try to get your work to be similar. And then after you've kind of understood those stylistic components, you build your own things. And I suppose that's maybe where some of this comes to. If you're working at it in a professional way, copying from other people's artwork is a stepping stone. It's going to show you the shortcuts they took, the methodologies they used to obtain a particular thing, and allow you to move forward. But it's never the end goal if it's a professional thing. At the end of learning how they did things, how their processes come to fruition, you're going to start employing those same strategies on your own artwork. And what you're going to arrive at is something that is distinctly yours, but is stylistically similar enough that it would fit in that realm. When I really tried to figure out how I was going to paint to make my style consistent, which, by the way, I think focusing on style specifically is generally a bad thing. It's going to kind of emerge, but I've got another video about that. You can check that out. I'll link it below. But in general, when I am trying to make sure that I make paintings of a particular style, I am looking at other people's paintings and I'm trying to figure out how they did things. In my own work, this has really come down to I prime everything with super bright colors, usually pinks, purples, or oranges. It shines out and it just gives me a much better chroma to work from. I also, at some point, thought that it was wrong to, sketch out or draw out my paintings on my canvases because I have this kind of formal background. I realized since that's really silly, so I will actually draw out, generally nowadays, with an acrylic brush pen on my canvases to get all of the basic shapes. And then I just try to use as few brush strokes as I can on the work, really developing points of interest like teeth and eyes, but leaving a lot of the other stuff more rough. This style I developed kind of by looking at other people's work, kind of by figuring out how I like to work, kind of by, taking on and copying some strategies from other people, but it's now distinctly mine. And this is exactly the same strategy that you are going to employ if you are copying from other artists' work with the goal of kind of making your own style, making your own kind of strategy for doing professional level work. But copying by its nature is not cheating. It's the failing to disclose that you copied or claiming that someone else's work is your own that's going to get you in trouble. The next notion here is copying from another artist is immoral or illegal. I just want to touch on this again really quickly. Copyright is very complicated. I would highly recommend delving into it if you want to do anything professionally. But in general, it's not illegal or immoral unless you are lying, unless you are stealing someone else's work and claiming it as your own, or if you are copying someone else's work and then selling it. In those realms, you're going to get into some trouble. Yet, I do have to mention that if you go to things like Comic-Con, in fact, we have a store here nearby in one of the little adjacent towns where they sell tons of fan art. And you see this at Comic-Cons, you see this online all over the place. And I'm not 100% sure why that's legal, but it seems to be. There are tons and tons of people who do not work for Marvel who are able to sell paintings and drawings they've made of Spider-Man and the X-Men. I don't know how this works. And again, the legal issues in this are pretty complicated. But The law, hypothetically, is built to protect the creative endeavors of artists. It doesn't always end up that way, but if you are trying to do that, or you have some desire to make art that is based on other people's franchises and intellectual property, look into the legality of it. There does seem to be a way, though it feels very obscure and very complicated to me. But copying, as long as you're not selling their work or claiming it as your own, is not only not illegal, but it's not immoral. It's not a bad thing. You've probably heard the term that mimicry is the height of flattery, and there is a sense of that being true. We've seen this in artistic communities for at least the last 500 or 600 years, that copying from the masters is not only seen as honoring and respectful toward them, but also as one of the best methodologies to improve your own skill. So if you have that mental hangup, I would encourage you to work through it a little bit. As long as you're not lying and stealing, you're generally okay when it comes to copying other people's artwork. In fact, if you're posting copies of other people's artwork that you've done on Instagram or on media like I'm doing here, I would highly recommend just mentioning that in the comments. A couple of the times where I've done time lapses of me working on things from Monster Hunter or even from anime or manga, I'm not claiming that that is mine at any point in time. What is mine is the actual act of the creation and then the talking that goes over the top of that. But I would never claim someone else's artwork as being my own. All right, so let's move into just straight up defending copying. The first thing I want to talk about is it's a super effective method to learn new things. So working from references, copying other artists' work is perhaps the most powerful methodology that you can use for gaining new things. When I want to know how to draw a dragon, I've got 2 routes to go. Actually, I've got 3 routes. I can try to just draw dragons, be dissatisfied with them, and then every single one that I do, I can come back to and try to change things. Inevitably, I am going to improve. Eventually, after trying to draw that snout and screwing it up 15 times, I'm probably going to find a better way to do that. The second option is to look up real-world photos, real-world adjacent things. So this is probably looking up Komodo dragons, different kinds of monitor lizards. I could look up a basilisk. I could look up snakes. I can work from real things, copy the textures from those, the eyes, the way that the bodies are put together. I could even try to figure out how wings might fit onto something like that. But that would be my second option, and it's actually a really good one. The third option, however, is to go find artists' interpretation of what a dragon looks like, and then to copy those, to work out how they solved the problems. How did they handle the muscular and bone structure? How did they make this mythological thing make sense? And that's a super effective strategy for learning how to draw new things. I've done that a lot with my dragons. In fact, when I did Smogus last year, I created a reference folder that was just a ton of dragons, and they were hugely helpful. I didn't copy any of them directly. I would copy aspects of them. How did this artist handle claws? How did this artist handle wings or eyes or face? Those individual things were then copied, generally not even in the piece, but off to the side, analyzing how the artist did it, and then put into my final piece. This is a wonderful, strategic way to approach your art. Secondarily, seeing how other artists solve problems is a super effective way to learn. And this is probably the best thing you can do when you're copying. Not just to have a finished product that you can go, look, this is wonderful. Look how I drew this character from this manga or anime. It's understanding how that particular manga artist unravels the human form in a convincing way. If you look at how the artists draw different eyes, different facial structures, you'll start to understand how they're simplifying things, because most drawings are a simplified version of reality. Yes, sometimes there'll be super realistic stuff, it's kind of boring, but most artists are working on simplifying extraordinarily complicated things into just a couple lines and shapes and some shading. That is the most effective thing you can glean from copying another artist's work, is trying to understand how they solved the problems. And this is something you cannot get from general reference work. If I, again, am trying to figure out how to draw a tree and I look at real trees, every piece of information I could ever need is there. Goodness, as I'm saying this, I'm reminded, like, I've used that phrase before talking to my students. And I just don't believe that in the same way that I used to. I mean, it's actually true. If you look at a tree, it has 100% of the information that you need in order to draw a tree. That is totally true. But It is far more effective from a time standpoint to find another artist who's drawn trees and basically figure out what details they've cut, because you don't need every single piece of bark and leaf on that tree in order for it to register as a tree. You can make a very simplified version of that and it still reads as tree. And copying from another artist's work is going to allow you to piggyback on them. You're going to be able to see further because you're standing on the backs of giants. And that's what copying allows you to do. So it is an incredibly good strategy just for seeing how other artists solve problems. And it's probably the number one way that I use it nowadays. I will copy other artists' work to figure out how they handle joints on a robot, how they imply textures on giant walls underneath the ground. The next thing I'm really going to be looking at is how emotion is displayed. Because again, if you look at a human face to see emotion, every piece that you need to understand is right there in front of you. But that's the problem, is it's too many pieces. To make a person seem happy, how many things are actually happening on the human face? It's a tremendous amount. You've got two eyes and you've got the flesh around the eyes. You've got the cheeks. You've got anything happening with the nose or the ears. Is there body posturing that's happening? And then you get to the mouth. And oh goodness, mouths are so complicated. But if you can look at another artist's work, you can shortcut some of that. You can figure out how they've solved those problems. And sometimes it's good to go back to reality later. After you've learned how an artist simplifies things, you've adapted, you've developed your own stylings for doing that, then you can go back to reality and figure out how to add in some more complications and unique qualities for your own work. But that is probably the best thing you can get from copying. The next note on here was actually copying difficult things makes them simpler. And this is true, and it really ties into what I was just talking about. Whereas if you are trying to work on emotions or the human face or something as simple, quote unquote, as a tree or a mountain, they're insanely complicated. Most of reality is insanely complicated. We just trick ourselves into thinking things are simple. We develop these schemas when we're young, simplified versions of drawing things. We think of smiley faces and boxes to be cubes and Christmas trees where they're just a triangle with a bunch of edges coming out the side. Those are called schemas. They're things that we have memorized as symbols to represent other things, but they're not true. Reality is incredibly complicated. The best thing you can get from another artist and copying their work is seeing how they've simplified very complicated things. The next thing here is that muscle memory is developed even as your brain struggles to dissect difficult things. So when you work on copying from reference or from another artist's work, there's a lot of things that are happening consciously and unconsciously. Your muscles are getting better at memorizing those particular motions, and your subconscious is interpreting things at the same time your conscious is. So if you're working on copying a robot from one of your favorite artists and you're seeing how they do that, you're actively copying individual components of that, but your subconscious is also realizing that there's relationships between a lot of those things. And those things then you'll start to notice, not necessarily actively in the near future, but they'll start bothering you. You'll look at a drawing and go, there's something wrong here, I don't know what it is. And in time, you'll be able to interpret what that thing is. So if you ever run into things when you're drawing where you're like, I don't know, I just feel like I need to do this. I feel like something's awry here. I feel like this hand is too big. That's your unconscious mind who's picked up on things that you don't consciously know about yet and is trying to point you in the right direction. The more you work on those things, the more your conscious mind understands, and honestly, the more gets relegated to your unconscious mind. A lot of really good professional artists are not thinking about every single thing they're doing as they're doing it because they've done it so much. So many of those complicated things are now relegated to unconscious mind, which is kind of ideal. That's kind of what you want to go for. Well, the last thing that I want to talk about here before I close out this episode is the difference between active and passive copying. I've used the term copying really loosely throughout this episode, but in the last couple minutes, I've kind of talked about the unconscious and the conscious mind. So active copying is where you are specifically analyzing a component of something. You are copying the joint structure on a robot. You are copying how the engines are producing thrust on a spaceship. You are copying how the jawline functions on a crocodile. That's active. You are specifically trying to figure out how something functions so you understand it better and can apply it later. This is different from what I did for most of my life, and I think probably what most artists do unconsciously when they work from reference is passive copying. The goal of passive copying is to produce as close a copy to the original work as possible. This doesn't sound devious at first. And there's nothing immoral about it, not devious in that sense, but devious in the sense that it tricks you. I am really good at passively copying, at looking at an image and translating it from physicality to physicality. The problem is that generally when you do that, you learn very little. I don't know how many times I've copied the human face or copied an animal from a photograph and made a beautiful drawing or a beautiful painting. And yet I get to the end of that and I understand no more about how humans are put together than I did before. Because all I'm looking at is replicating shapes and shadows and color. And that's fine if that's what you're looking for. If your desire is just to replicate things and make pretty things, then by all means do that. That's how I was taught to paint. And there's nothing wrong with that, because if you really understand shape relationships, you can actually learn how to build those things from imagination as well. But when you are passively copying, you are replicating things. And for most artists, this is dissatisfying. Most artists are not happy to just have copied a thing. In fact, this is what I ran into as a teacher, and probably what you've seen in your life as well. A student will produce a piece of work that looks marvelous. Perhaps it's a drawing of a flamingo, and it looks so good. And they'll get compliments on it. And what are their responses? Thank you, but I just copied it. Thank you, but this is from a photograph. There's almost always something dismissive there. And there's some subtle issues there in how at least American culture perceives art in general. The deeper thing here is artists in general would rather be able to do that from memory, do that from imagination. And yet, we're taught often in school, and I am guilty of this as well for many years as I was kind of uncovering what it really truly takes to draw from imagination. I taught kids for years how to draw from reference, even kids with very little artistic skill who were then able to make a drawing or a painting that looked exactly like what it was that they were trying to copy. And there is something good there. I think it's a good place to start. Because often it teaches young kids that they are capable of making art. They are capable of making something pretty. It's a good starting point. The problem is that for myself and for a lot of other artists, if that's all you do for years, you only really get better at that skill. You get better at replicating things, better at taking something from a picture and putting it onto a canvas. And again, if that's all you want, great. But for me, that was never enough. I wanted not just to copy a drawing of a moose and make a good drawing of a moose, or copy a painting of a toucan and make a beautiful painting. I wanted to be able to draw a bird from my memory. I wanted to be able to design a bird. I wanted to understand how birds worked. I didn't want to be limited to only being able to work on art when I could look at pictures and copy things. And so if you find yourself in a similar situation, there's a really good chance that you are predominantly passively copying. And maybe this is part of the reason why it's got a stigma, why some people don't think it helps, why some people don't think it's a good thing. But if you actively copy, it's like actively studying for a test. You're not just memorizing all the details, you're trying to learn the why, you're trying to learn the how, you're trying to understand the function of those things. And it's just a lot more effective. So if you've never done this, I would encourage you to try doing this. Copy from reference, but copy things specifically. So pull up a photograph of someone's face and copy individual components of that. And then immediately apply those things. Try to draw that smile. Try to draw a smile. Try to alter that smile. One of the most effective ways you can do this is actually pick up a pose of a person, draw that, and then without looking up another photo, try to shift the angle slightly. It forces you to think about and understand all of these components. Now, I will say that active copying takes a lot more mental energy than passive copying, which is probably, again, why it's done less. But it's a far more effective strategy for actually committing things to memory and learning how things are built. If you want to hear more about this in another episode, let me know. I could probably actually do a little demonstration on the difference between active and passive copying, but I'll do that if y'all are interested. Let me know. Well, what about my thoughts? I think they've been pretty clear here. I was brought up in a pretty traditional art tradition and was taught that pretty much drawing from imagination was silly and not worth doing, which frankly I think comes from the fact that most of my teachers didn't know how to do it. And so in order to distance themselves from that discomfort, they just labeled it as other, as wrong. But I was taught primarily how to copy things. Like that's what all my painting courses were, all my drawing courses were. There was no imaginative work there. The only time I got to do stuff like that at all was in my graphic design courses. And even there was almost no discussion on how to do that. So, I taught for 11 years in the public schools, and I, of course, began teaching the exact same way I was taught. Over time, I shifted and changed as I, kept working on my own art and then watched my students and constantly evaluated what was going on. And over time, I came to the conclusion that copying is a good thing, that it's a shortcut in a lot of ways, that we don't need to be so arrogant and proud about what we're trying to do, that there's no reason to keep this like highbrow thinking about the fine arts and twisting our mustaches and whatnot. That's just not necessary. And that there are really lovely benefits that come from copying other artists' work and from working from reference. I softened over time and have continued to soften even more as I've gotten out of the educational world. And I can I feel like, see the forest and the trees simultaneously as opposed to being linked to only one. And it puts me in a much better place. So yeah, as a teacher at the end of my teaching career, and then also just nowadays as I talk to other artists, copying is a wonderful strategy. As long as you're not doing anything illegal, not claiming it as your own and stealing other people's work, it is one of the most effective strategies you can use. And I do it all the time in my own work. Most of the time I hit big breakthroughs is when I copy another artist's work and can figure out how they solved an issue. That allows me to crack into something, understand it just enough that then I can decide how I want to solve that issue in the future. And that's pretty much what's happened with all my ink work. It's what's happened with my paintings. It's what's happened with all my robots and my dragons. All the stuff that I really enjoy has been the product of active copying of references and other artists' work, and then deciding how I want to implement those strategies. Well, I hope this has been beneficial for you. I know that copying and working from references and other artists' work has a huge stigma in the artistic community, and this is my perspective on that. I don't know that it's correct. Obviously, I believe it is, but I am but one human, and I would love to hear from you in the comments down below about your thoughts on this matter as well. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out the Patreon, it is linked in the description down below, alongside the link to the Discord server, which is a small community of artists. It's totally free to join, but you can get some feedback on your work there, share your work, just talk to other artists if you don't have much of a community. I would encourage you to check it out. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon. And if there's been weird noise in the background, it's because the wind picked up and it's howling outside my door and window right now. But hopefully that hasn't been too distracting. All right, have a good one.